few years ago, I attended a one-day seminar for AP Art History teachers in New York City. The seminar leader, an AP veteran, told us that students tended to score lowest on architecture questions and on medieval art questions. So a medieval Christian cathedral, he told us, is a perfect storm. The good news is that now we have a list of required churches, and that narrows the challenge a little. Your test will include 2 church matching quizzes, matching churches and matching floor plans. We are not going to ask you the wicked church parts matching quiz questions, quite possibly the meanest quizzes I've written in a long career of wicked witchery. I still think they're worth at least one run-through, just to help you keep church architecture vocabulary straight. On the actual AP exam, you are not likely to get direct questions about church architecture vocabulary, but you will sometimes need to know this vocabulary to answer questions, and especially to eliminate wrong answers. No, I have not switched units. I'm showing you these plans of the Egyptian temple of Amun-Re, the Hindu Lakshmana temple to Vishnu, and the Parthenon, a temple to Athena, to make an important comparative point about all Christian churches. Like other sacred spaces, the churches from this unit are centers for ritual and ceremony. They often include elaborate decoration, and they are frequently, though not always, located in places with spiritual, historical, or political significance. They even have an element of exclusivity. Until the Protestant Reformation, churches, both Catholic and Orthodox, always had spaces reserved solely for the priests, clergy, and, in the case of Byzantine or Orthodox churches, the emperor. But Christian churches are not houses of a god or a cult image, and the rituals and ceremonies that take place inside them are congregational. In other words, the rituals are meant to be seen and participated in by large groups of people. This functional and theological imperative drove church architecture from the time that the church was large enough and legal enough to attract crowds. The basilica plan used for Roman administrative buildings fit this need perfectly, and it had the added benefit of conveying imperial approval and authority for the religion. Here we see the Santa Sabina plan, and arguably our 2 most important church vocabulary terms. The nave is the large open space at the center of every church. The rounded apse, once the site of a cult statue, and the law courts, now houses the altar, a sacred space for priests, but also a space that can be seen by the entire congregation. The image on the top left is Basilica Ulpia. On the bottom right is Santa Sabina. Note that both have not only a large open space, but a nave arcade set apart by arches and columns. Santa Sabina's comes from old Roman temples. Do you remember the word for that? It will be on the test. So what are some other features of a typical basilican church? Well, 2 other words that for that long rectangular nave plan are longitudinal or axial. We see a flat timber roof, clerestory windows letting in light from above, the apse holding the altar, and the aisles, in this case set off again by an arcade. Timber roofs were not all that heavy, so they did not need thick walls for support, but of course they did catch fire. Do you see a dome, a barrel vault, or a groin vault? Nope. Those are features of the central plan churches or the later Byzantine churches that combined basilican form with a dome. This is an early Christian, not a Byzantine basilica. We've talked about the advantages of basilica plan. There were advantages to a central plan as well. I hope you all recognize the Pantheon on the left and 2 images of San Vitale are on the right. Both buildings share a distinctive and famous feature that a central plan makes possible, a soaring dome leading viewers' eyes and thoughts heavenwards. San Vitale differs from the Pantheon in that it includes what architectural feature, like a racetrack, and still puzzles architectural historians. Well, it's the entryway to the church, and the same name persists through Romanesque and Gothic eras up to today. It is the church entryway, or narthex. For nearly 1,000 years, Hagia Sophia was the largest cathedral in the world. Remember, Sinan the Great spent his lifetime trying to equal it in the name of Allah. And what is the name of his mosque that imitated the Hagia Sophia? You will need to know. So, is Hagia Sophia a basilican axial plan or a central plan church? Well, the answer is that it's both, which is what made Hagia Sophia so transformative in the history of architecture. Justinian wanted to have it all. The huge rectangular spaces of the Basilican Church, the soaring domes of the central plan, and he chose as his architects two mathematicians who came up with a solution that's brilliant. Half domes and pendentives helped support the central dome, allowing for the addition of clerestory windows that bathe the church in light. More light still comes from the characteristic art of the Byzantines, the Mosaic. Romanesque churches carried doors to a whole new level. These churches were built to house relics and attract pilgrims to see those relics, and the master builders were all about wowing and terrifying the pilgrims who crossed their threshold. This period also saw the revival of monumental stone sculpture in Europe, really for the first time since ancient Rome. So there's one rather tough question about the sculpture above the door of the church at Santa Foy at Conques. I'm going to use the process of elimination to help you. The Last Judgment theme was common in Romanesque sculpture, right? The spatial setting is symbolic rather than realistic, right? The work doesn't really represent a continuous narrative, but rather a set-piece moment. But the sculpture is all about what? It's the remaining answer, which you would probably know anyway. Hint, consider what Christ is doing with his hands. Note that the saved and the damned are separated, with the saved on the left and the damned on the right, as we look at the door, that is. The spatial segregation reinforced the point that pilgrims entered the church as sinners, but the pilgrimage helped ensure that they would leave numbered among the saved. So movement through the church was in a way echoed on the frieze. Here's a labeled floor plan and a photo of the nave from our required Romanesque pilgrimage monastery church. Note that church design evolved to address the needs of pilgrimage. The radiating chapels held relics, and the ambulatory made it easier for pilgrims to get to those relics without disturbing the monks during their many church services. The transept was now quite wide to accommodate the crowds, and the church architect added a transept exit for further crowd control. The interior photo on the right reveals a nave with only 2 levels, and that nave is covered with a rounded arch barrel vault defined by a series of transverse arches, the most characteristic feature of Romanesque churches. The barrel vaults enable the ceiling to soar, but not to the heights we will see in Gothic churches, or for that matter, that we saw in the Byzantine dome churches. Stone barrel vaults are less likely to catch fire than timber roofs, but they are heavy. So what kind of adjectives would you apply to Romanesque architecture? Massive, heavy, impressive, symmetrical? Any of those would work. What is the mathematical unit at the center of a Romanesque church plan where the transept and the nave intersect? I've outlined it in green to help you out. The nave of the church is organized in 3-dimensional modules based on the unit that I've outlined in yellow, and these modules are called bays. And now we move on to Gothic art. So why were Abbot Suger and his church at Saint-Denis so important in art history? The photo and the floor plan should offer a big hint. The radiating chapels have opened up to create a huge clerestory of stained glass, bringing what Abbot Suger called lux nova pouring into the church. The spiritual force of light, he believed, led worshippers' thoughts toward the divine. And this was a major element in Gothic Christian theology, and in part it reflected a renewed study of classical writers, especially Aristotle and Plato. Remember that this was an age when universities were being established in cities and Christian humanism was on the rise. Romanesque churches were mostly parts of monasteries, often monasteries in relatively rural areas on the road to Santiago de Compostela. Gothic churches were built as urban churches, reflecting the rise of major cities such as Paris. Gothic churches were also often associated with royal power. Certainly this is true of both Saint-Denis and our required church, Chartres. So here's a quick review of the architectural innovations that made it possible for Gothic churches to soar so high and to break up their walls with huge expanses of stained glass. Pointed arches were used to direct weight onto load-bearing columns at a sharp angle, and this allowed for much taller vaulted ceilings. Unlike earlier Romanesque-style churches, Gothic churches emphasized height and verticality. A second innovation that allowed Gothic churches to soar higher and include huge stained glass windows was the flying buttress. Gothic architects did away with the tribune galleries, they exposed the buttresses, and they pared them down to slender skeletal supports. They also carved them and topped them with little spires, making the buttresses an essential part of the decorative element of the facade. And this slide helpfully relates the flying buttresses of Chartres Cathedral to its complicated floor plan. Ribbed vaults were a third innovation that permitted Gothic cathedrals to expand vertically and to accommodate walls of glass. Oh, and here is that scary floor plan of Chartres Cathedral that's included in the terrifying matching quiz that will not be on your unit test. I'm not going to go back over these terms, but you should notice that the vaults not only organize and define the space in the church, but give it a sense of rhythm. The nave is long relative to the transept. These churches were designed to hold the entire congregation of the city rather than to accommodate visiting pilgrims. The radiating chapels open out more to the apse, and really they become part of the worship space. Once again, the form is related to an evolving religious function. So I realize that on your Chartres video you saw a dizzying number of doorways and jam statues. This is the doorway that's included among your required images. It is also indeed more commonly referred to as the royal portal. Essentially, these figures serve to introduce and support the themes of this sacred space, both physically and theologically or morally. And this in turn links to the jam figures below, who also stand for power, in this case both spiritual and temporal power. They are almost certainly Old Testament kings, but they are also stand-ins, sort of, for the French king in nearby Paris. But it's the Old Testament figure, not the French kings, who gave the name to the portals. And by the way, these portals were used by royalty and the church hierarchy, not by commoners, so we have more exclusivity. Khan Academy has a series of videos on Chartres that I did not assign and you did not watch in class, but I highly recommend that you watch at least the first one because it talks about pilgrimages, the transition from Romanesque to Gothic, the history of Chartres Cathedral, the central role played by the Virgin Mary and French kings, and the royal portal. That's a lot of important stuff, and the podcast is only 5 minutes, so I think it would be a good use of your time. Remember that your short essay question will ask about the stained glass window at Chartres, La Belle Dame Verrières. The link is up on Moodle. In my second test review podcast, I'll look at art from this unit other than churches.